Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to part two of our Chapter 5 lecture, The Police Role in Society. And before we jump into power and discretion, I want to talk quickly about a survey. So, in the most recent and comprehensive study of police attitudes, a Pew Research Center study using the National Police Research Platform data from about 8,000 officers revealed that about 66% of police officers say the deaths of Black Americans during encounters with police are isolated incidents, not a sign that law enforcement is, basically characterized by, systemic bias. However, 60% of the general population did believe that there was a broader problem between police and minority communities. And most officers reported that a high profile death, or a lot of these high profile deaths, have made their job even harder. More than 7 in 10 say that officers are less likely to stop and question suspicious people. Roughly 3/4 agree that fellow officers report that they are reluctant to even use force when necessary. And more than 9 in 10 agreed that fellow officers have grown more worried about their safety. Now, with that being said, the study also shows kind of a wide gap in perception between police officers and members of the public, but there is, also a divide between Black officers and others. While 72% of white and Hispanic officers agreed that Blacks killed in police altercations are in fact isolated incidents, a majority of Black officers say those deaths are a sign of a broader problem between police and Black citizens. About 92% of white officers say the country has made the changes needed to achieve equality between Black and white citizens, compared to only 29% of Black officers. So, and then finally, 6 in 10 white and Hispanic officers alike agreed their department's police, had a positive relationship with the Black community, but only 32% of Black officers agreed. So this is a Pew Research Center survey. I have the links in this presentation, and it's from the year 2017, so it's not that old, okay? And what this study reveals is that there's no national consensus on whether there is a current problem with policing, much less an agreement on approaches on improving policing. Okay, so let's talk a little bit now about power and discretion. So, Clockars in 1984 describes police control as consisting of the following elements. So that would be authority, power, persuasion, and force. And we'll look at each one of those kind of defined. So authority would be the, unquestionable entitlement to be obeyed that comes from fulfilling a specific role. Power is the right inherent in a role to use any means to overcome resistance. Persuasion would be the use, of signs, symbols, words, and arguments to induce compliance. And then finally, force is the authority to use physical coercion to overcome the will of an individual. Now, at, any police officer basically at any time might have the need or opportunity to exercise one of these 4 different types of authority. It then comes down to that word discretion. And by definition, the authority to make a decision between 2 or more choices or courses of behavior. So, why then does law enforcement have the right to employ these types of control? Well, the answer to that is actually fairly easy. It's because we give it to them. Okay? So, under what we call a social contract, kind of according to this theory, each citizen gives up certain freedoms, right? in return for protection. Police power is, in essence, part of a quid pro quo, meaning we give the police these powers to protect us, but we also recognize that the power can be abused or it can be used against us. Okay, so, we kind of have to kind of keep that in mind. But it's like when you go to the airport, you have to go through the screener. That's part of, police power, if you will, law enforcement power. But you give that up to go through the screening thing, etc., for safety. So this is kind of the social contract that we all get into. Now, again, Cohen and Feldberg developed a careful analysis of and justification for police power. And again, they proposed it in that social contract that I called you. And again, freedom is given up in return for this, our protection. And police power, as I said, is part of this kind of quid pro quo where we give police the power to protect us, but we also recognize that it could be used against us. And this general idea basically has, some different principles attached to it. So basically 3. So first, each of us should be able to feel protected. And if not, we are not gaining anything from that social contract, right? And may decide to kind of renegotiate the contract by regaining some of those liberties that we gave up in the first place. Second, would be because the deprivation of freedoms are limited to those, necessary to ensure protection against others, police power should be kind of circumscribed to the minimum necessary to meet the goals for protection. Okay. And, if police exceed that threshold, the public can, or should rightly object. And then finally, the third is that police ethics are kind of, linked to their purpose. If the social contract is their basis of their power, it is also the basis of their ethics. So that, and that actually makes a lot of sense, right? And again, Cohen and Feldberg propose 5, ethical standards that can be derived from that social contract. And that would be fair access, public trust, safety and security, teamwork, and objectivity. So, keep in mind, though, that law enforcement, if it is lawful, objective, and professional, is part of the foundation of a stable government and, in fact, the hallmark of democratic societies. And Banks in 2014 points out the elements of democratic policing. And he tells us that would be responsiveness, accountability, defense of human rights, and then finally, transparency. Okay, and then finally, kind of going through again power and discretion. Pino and Wyatrowski in 2006 basically kind of argue that democratic policing should include the rule of law, legitimacy, transparency, accountability, and subordination to civil authority. So, kind of finishing up then with, the power and discretion, or talking a little bit about power and discretion, if you will. Law enforcement professionals have a great deal of discretion regarding when to enforce a law, how to enforce it, how to handle disputes, when to use force, sorry for the typo there, and so on. Because every day is filled with decisions, right? Some, kind of minor and some kind of major. And discretion allows officers to choose different courses of action depending on how they perceive their duty. Okay, so what the perception is of their duty. Now, duty can be defined as the responsibilities that are attached to a specific role. And in the case of police officers, there are a myriad, meaning a lot of different types of duties that are attached to their role. However, there is also a great deal of individual variation in how officers perceive their duty. Okay, so hopefully that kind of makes sense. So by definition, discretion again is the authority to decide between two or more choices, and duty is required behavior or action that is the responsibilities that are attached to that specific role. Now, again, still talking about power and discretion, and then we'll kind of shift gears a little bit. One way that researchers have described how discretion is utilized would be through typologies of police, right? The different types, how they think and are perceived. And Wilson in 1976, in one of the kind of classic typologies, describes policing styles as the following. The first would be the legalistic style of policing, and that's kind of described as the least amenable to discretionary enforcement. So officers enforce the law objectively without any exceptions at all. And I threw this picture in here because this photo on the left is actually this photo's been around for a long time, depicting law enforcement, etc. But sometimes law enforcement now is viewed a little bit differently. So it's a very unique picture, and I really want you to kind of take note of it. But that's the legalistic style, okay? Next would be the watchman style. And the watchman style of policing is described as police who define situations as threatening or serious depending on the group or individuals involved, and then they act accordingly. And then finally would be the caretaker. And the caretaker style of policing is described as, as police who treat citizens differently depending upon their relative power and position in society. So some people get a break and some people do not. It depends where you're at in the level of socioeconomic or power, etc. Right? So if you're an important individual, you might get a break, and if you're not important, then chances are you're not going to get a break. Now, understand, before we get into ethics for police officers, that police officers are the most visible members of a police force and have a duty to patrol, monitor, and intervene in matters of crime, conflict, accidents, and welfare. And patrol officers possess a great deal of discretion in defining criminal behavior and deciding what to do about it. And studies indicate that police do not arrest in many cases where they actually legally could. So there is a lot of okay discretion in there. Now, discretion also comes into play when the officer is faced with situations that have really kind of no good solutions. Okay? So, and that's some of the exercises that you do weekly, those little one-pagers where you have that ethical dilemma. So those are why that's important that you're doing that, so you can kind of understand. Okay, so let's talk now quickly about formal ethics of police officers. So a professional code of ethics exists for most professions. For instance, doctors pledge their allegiance to the Hippocratic Oath, right? Lawyers are taught their professional code of responsibility. Psychiatrists subscribe to the code, promulgated by their professional organization. In fact, having a professional code of ethics seems to be part of the definition of a profession, right? Professional, along with some form of kind of self-regulation. Now, a code of ethics helps basically engender, if you will, self-respect in individual officers. Pride comes from knowing that one has conducted themselves in a proper and appropriate manner. And further, a code of ethics contributes to mutual respect among law enforcement officers, and helps in the development of what we call teamwork or esprit de corps, and also common goals. So it really is important, having an agreed upon code really is kind of a unifying element, if you will. And that's always a good thing. And police officers generally pledge an oath upon graduation from the police academy, okay, the law enforcement code of ethics, etc. And many police agencies have adopted a code of ethics. Other agencies accomplish this same purpose by a value or a mission statement, which I have there on the page, that identifies what values are held most important to the department. All right. And these documents may be wall hangings, kind of like this one here that was in the hallway of the Rialto Police Department and several parts around the building so people could see it. This was kind of our tagline. You can see it on the side of our cars, and then within our mission and value statement, committed to community, etc. So again, these documents can may be wall hangings, forgotten once after an officer's graduated from the academy, or they might be visible and often repeated elements in the culture of an agency, known to everybody, used for guides for behavior by administrators, etc. So it really is important. And recent research indicates that code of ethics are more effective in influencing behavior when they are familiar to the members of the organization and when they are written and are perceived as useful. So really the code is the fabric of the organization and part of the socialization, okay? And principles of these codes really have to be strictly enforced. Now, some agencies that have kind of come along when we talk about the Law Enforcement Code of Ethics, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, IACP, has promulgated the Law Enforcement Code of Ethics and canons of police ethics, and many departments have used these or adopted them for their own agencies. And more recently, the IACP has endorsed what they call the Oath of Honor. Okay, and this oath, developed by a committee of the IACP membership, is offered, kind of as a shortened version, encapsulating the contents of that code of ethics. Now, IACP code or other codes of ethics for law enforcement have at least 4 major themes that kind of run through them. And those really are, justice or fairness. That's the single most dominant theme in the law enforcement code. Police officers must uphold the law regardless of the offender's identity. They must not single out special groups for different treatment, must not use their authority and power to take advantage either for personal profit or personal goals, etc. They must avoid gratuities because these give the appearance of special treatment. The second theme is service. Police officers exist to serve the community, right? And their role appropriately and essentially concerns this idea. And public service involves checking on, the elderly, having community events, helping victims, and the community service model, taking a broad approach to service by helping the community. Okay? Still another theme is the importance of law. Police, protectors, they're protectors of the Constitution and must not substitute rules, their own rules, because the law is important. Police must not only be concerned with lawbreakers, but also their own behavior and operate within the bounds of the law. And then the final theme is, personal conduct. Police must uphold a standard of behavior consistent with, their public position. The bar is higher, people. And this involves a higher standard of behavior in their professional, and their personal lives, okay, than is expected from the general public. And there's a phrase, and it's actually a violation of most policy. It's called conduct unbecoming, is one of the most often cited disciplinary infractions. And again, it can include everything from, something criminal to having an affair or being drunk in public. So even your personal conduct comes into play as it relates to ethics within the criminal justice system. And again, I say, read the code of ethics and tell me if you can live up to that, because you know what? It's a little harder than it looks. Okay, so let's talk now about the police subculture. So research has long described an occupational culture that is at odds with the formal ethics and values of the police organization, as well as a larger society. And factors that lead to the extreme nature of the police culture are: one, police typically form kind of a homogeneous social group, meaning that they usually hang out with their own, because the thought is that, only their own kind of know what they're going through, etc. Next would be they have a uniquely stressful work environment. So again, that ties in with the homogeneous social group, because they work with these people. They know that these same people can understand what's going on and the stress that they're actually going through. And then finally, that they participate in basically a closed social system for those two reasons that I kind of just cited that are above. Okay, so kind of an interesting thing as it relates to police subculture. So as we talk a little bit more about it, and we talk about themes and value systems, this is a kind of a unique conglomeration of organizational values, beliefs, and expectations that is passed on to new officers in the department. This is actually kind of the definition of police culture, if you will. And then, as we talk about perception and police culture, or the subculture, a lot of times officers tend to be distrustful and suspicious of citizens. They have a tendency to assess people in situation in terms of their potential threat. Okay, they've got the lay low or kind of cover your ass type attitude. And sometimes it's even the us versus them attitude. And to show you how this kind of permeates a little bit, I'll give you kind of a personal example as it relates to number 2. Assessing people in situations in terms of threat. Still to this day, even though I've been retired since December of 2015, when I go into a restaurant, I always sit with my back against the wall. And so I can see the front door of a business, etc., a restaurant. And the rationale for that is that I can look at people and keep my situational awareness kind of, in check, and I can see any potential dangers. But that was kind of ground into me. So you can kind of see how that culture kind of permeates in. And that's one example of that. So, kind of going from themes and value systems, now moving over to the cop code. Now, many authors present versions of an informal code of conduct that new officers are taught through kind of an informal socialization that is really quite different, from the, code of ethics. Okay. And kind of a little bit more, there's an article or a paper by Russ Iani in 1983, and this presented the most complete cop code that included principles to watch, out for our partners, never give up, um, or never give up another cop, be aggressive, don't implicate any other cop, don't leave work for other cops. The informal code also specified conduct indicating that management was not to be trusted. Cover your ass, if you will. Don't make waves, keep out of the way. Don't do the boss's work. Don't trust the boss. And this was a code kind of a long time ago. And as someone again that was in law enforcement 30 years ago, yeah, it was. I've been a cop for 34 years, retired as a chief, started as a police officer, and it was kind of like that early on. And then as we started to go through the different, as years progressed through, it actually did change. But, today there are still some agencies that have some of this cop code kind of built in, if you will. And then we talk about police culture and what's called noble cause. So noble cause corruption refers to the utilitarian concept that the end, of crime fighting, if you will, justifies the means that might otherwise be legal, illegal, unethical, and or against the rules or regulations. And that could be things such as maybe stretching the truth, which actually, in my view as a former chief, is lying. Okay, saying something not correct on the witness stand, maybe altering evidence or something like that. So arguably, the police culture, at least in some locales, kind of tolerates some of this activity. But we know, and we should know that the end really doesn't justify the means in that particular sense. But this is the police culture and what they call the noble cause, meaning if you have to stretch things a little bit to get the, criminal off the street, is it worth doing that? Or is it better to work within the confines of the law and do your best to get the suspect, lawfully, etc., without violating somebody's rights and things like that? So that's kind of a comparison to look at. Okay, so as we're kind of getting to a close, we'll talk about a couple other things quick. One would be what they call the police culture, loyalty, and the blue curtain of secrecy. So another element of the police code is absolute loyalty to other officers, even if it means not coming forward to expose a wrongdoer. And variously described as the code of silence, the blue wall, the blue curtain of secrecy, or other terms, it refers to the subculture code of don't give up another cop. And this phenomenon has been recognized in academic literature, first-person accounts by former officers, and even cited in court holdings. Okay, so it is something that's out there, and it should also be noted that a code of silence is also present in other occupations and careers and groups as well, even when members engage in incompetent or corrupt activities. So it's not just law enforcement. Okay, a lot of times there's this loyalty thing covering somebody else in all different types of professions. And one of the larger or more well-known examples would be in the book Serpico. And this was back in 1973, and this book describes how Frank Serpico became basically a whistleblower against New York PD officers who were involved in basically corrupt activity, taking money, bribes, etc. And he was, shot in a drug raid and believes that fellow officers conspired to kill him. And he went on to testify against this corruption, but never again was an NYPD officer. And his name is basically used as a, kind of a epithet, if you will, by many officers today. So, again, this is kind of the thought process of the police culture, loyalty, the blue wall, the blue curtain, etc. Okay. And, and then kind of just looking at this picture, and then we're almost there. I do want you to understand that there are different meanings for this. Okay, typically it's the line between, they call it the thin blue line. It's the line between good and evil. But there are some individuals that might look at it as it's the us against them type thing. It's some, secret tattoo or something that all these officers have and things like that. And that really is not the case based on my experience. So I just want you to know that there are different thought processes on what this actually might mean. So typically it's meant to be the line between good and evil, that line in the middle that kind of holds off the evil. But in some people, they've kind of made it look like it's the us versus them type thing. But enough of that. But that is what they call the thin blue line. And then again, by definitions, I have the code of silence and the blue curtain of secrecy. And there are different names for this as well. Okay, so police culture today. So our description of the police culture, dates back more than 40 years. And so a legitimate question is whether modern police officers subscribe to the same set of values and whether the cop code really does still exist. Arguably, the subculture and values described, that we've talked about, may be breaking down in police departments today. And in some places, maybe not. But several factors contribute to the possible weakening of this particular subculture. Okay. And here are a couple of examples of that. One could be increasing diversity. So the increasing diversity of police recruits has eliminated, done some eliminating, if you will, of the social, kind of homogeneity, if you will, of the workforce. Many diverse groups are now represented in police departments, including African American, Hispanic, people of other ethnicities, women, college, educated recruits, etc. Just, from everywhere. And these different groups bring elements of their own culture and backgrounds and value systems into that police environment. Now, police unions, with their increasing power, formalize relationships between the line staff and the administration. And, these subcultural methods for coping with perceived administrative unfairness are giving way to more formal rather than informal means of balancing different objectives of management and line staff. And then finally, civil litigation has basically increased the risk of covering for another officer. Having that blue curtain of silence, if you will. Although police officers may, not tell the truth to internal affairs or even on a witness stand to save a fellow officer from sanctions, they may be less likely to do so when large monetary damages may be leveled against them because of negligence or possibly, being charged with perjury. So, different lawsuits, civil litigation, etc., have really kind of increased that risk for covering for someone, and you don't want to get involved in that. So you really have, over the years, seen a change in a lot of the police culture. You have a lot of younger people in there now. You have all these different ethnicities, gender. I mean, it's just all over the map, which really makes for a better mixed organizational culture. And we talked about that. Okay, so we actually did, we're at about the 34-minute mark, so just a little bit over 60 minutes total, but that's not as bad as I thought it was going to be. We had a lot to cover, and I wanted to make sure that I got everything in. So with that being said, that's going to conclude our lecture for Chapter 5, Part 2, the police role in society.